Every war produces its share of heroes, but some stories cut deeper than others. Some stories reveal what happens when an ordinary man faces the impossible and chooses to stand when every instinct screams to run. Tonight, we're diving into one of those stories. A story about a fighter pilot who didn't just defy the odds, he rewrote them. This isn't about medals, though he earned plenty. This isn't about fame, though his name should be known by every American. This is about the moment when everything you believe you've trained in gets tested in the most brutal way imaginable. And what George A. Davis did in that moment changed the course of aerial warfare forever. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that like button. If you think heroes like George Davis should never be forgotten, make sure to subscribe, because this is the kind of legend they don't teach in history class. But we tell it here. This is the story of a man who turned the sky into his battlefield and proved that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's flying straight into hell when everyone else is flying away. Before we dive into the heat of battle, before the dogfights and the impossible odds, we need to go back to where it all began. Because heroes aren't born in the cockpit. They're forged long before they ever touch the controls of a fighter plane. George Andrew Davis Jr. was born on December 1st, 1920 in Dublin, Texas. A small town where everyone knew everyone and dreams didn't often reach beyond the county line. His father worked the railroad, honest work that put food on the table and kept the lights on. His mother kept the household running with the kind of quiet strength that holds families together during tough times. George wasn't the biggest kid in school. He wasn't the loudest or the most popular. But there was something in his eyes, something that teachers and neighbors noticed. A focus that seemed older than his years. While other kids were playing in the dirt, George would lie on his back in the yard, staring up at the clouds, watching them drift across the endless Texas sky. He'd imagine what it would be like to soar through those clouds, to see the world from up there where everything looked small and peaceful. By the time he was in high school, that quiet kid had grown into something else. 6 feet tall, lean, with hands that seemed built for precision work. He wasn't much for talking, but when he did speak, people listened. His grades were solid, not spectacular, but consistent. Like everything else about George, there was a steady reliability that you could count on. Teachers would later say he had the kind of mind that absorbed information and held on to it. The kind of student who might not raise his hand first, but when he did, his answer was always right. When George graduated in 1938, the world was already shifting. War clouds were gathering over Europe, though most folks in Dublin, Texas couldn't imagine how those distant storms would soon reach their own backyard. George had options. He could work the railroad like his father. He could try his luck in the oil fields. Maybe go to college if the money could be found. But George had already made his choice. He'd been making it every time he looked up at that big Texas sky. In 1940, 2 years after graduation, George enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps. Not because he was running from something, not because he didn't have other choices, but because he'd found his calling. Flying wasn't just what he wanted to do. It was what he was meant to do. The recruiters saw it immediately. This wasn't some starry-eyed kid looking for adventure. This was a man who understood what he was signing up for and had the steel to see it through. Flight training began at Randolph Field in San Antonio. They called it the West Point of the air, and for good reason. The standards were brutal. The washout rate was staggering. Young men who dreamed of flying since childhood found themselves grounded and reassigned after just a few weeks. The training was designed to break you down, to find your limits, and then push you past them. Because when you're flying a fighter plane at 400 miles per hour with enemy bullets screaming past your head, there's no room for hesitation, no time for second guessing. You either have what it takes or you don't. George had it. From his first solo flight, instructors knew they were watching something special. His hands on the controls were steady, confident. His decision-making was crisp, instinctive. When other cadets were still struggling with basic maneuvers, George was already thinking 3 moves ahead. He flew like he'd been doing it his whole life, like the airplane was just an extension of his body. But technical skill was only part of it. What set George apart was his mind. Fighter pilots are problem solvers. Every dogfight is a puzzle that has to be solved in seconds while pulling 6 Gs and watching for enemy fire. You have to calculate angles, speeds, ammunition counts, fuel levels, weather conditions, and enemy capabilities, all while making split-second decisions that mean the difference between life and death. George's mind worked like a computer, processing information faster than his instructors thought possible. By the time he earned his wings in 1941, George Davis had already caught the attention of his superiors. This wasn't just another pilot. This was someone who could lead, someone who could teach others, someone who could be counted on when everything went wrong. He was assigned to the 348th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts, big, powerful aircraft built for one purpose: to dominate the sky. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. The war that had seemed so distant suddenly became very personal, very urgent. America was in it now, whether we wanted to be or not. And pilots like George Davis were about to become the tip of the spear in a global conflict that would test every skill, every instinct, every ounce of courage they possessed. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast of an aircraft, 8 50 caliber machine guns, a massive radial engine that could push the plane to over 400 miles per hour. Armor plating that could take a beating and keep flying. It wasn't the prettiest fighter in the sky, but it was tough, reliable, and deadly in the right hands. George's hands were definitely the right hands. His first combat missions came in the Pacific Theater, where American forces were slowly pushing back against Japanese expansion. The Japanese had some of the best pilots in the world, flying aircraft specifically designed for air-to-air combat. They were experienced, well-trained, and absolutely ruthless. American pilots were learning on the job, adapting tactics, figuring out how to use their aircraft's strengths while minimizing weaknesses. George learned fast. His first kill came during a bomber escort mission. A Japanese Zero had broken through the formation, diving toward the bombers from above. George saw the threat, adjusted his approach, and put himself between the enemy fighter and the bombers. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, the Zero was spiraling toward the ocean, and George was already scanning for the next threat. But kills weren't what made George special. Plenty of pilots could shoot down enemy aircraft. What made George different was his ability to see the bigger picture, to understand not just his own fight but the entire battle unfolding around him. He could coordinate with other pilots, direct attacks, protect vulnerable bombers, and still maintain his own offensive capabilities. He was becoming more than just a fighter pilot, he was becoming a leader. Mission after mission, George Davis proved himself. Not with flashy heroics or reckless stunts, but with steady professional excellence. He brought his planes home. He brought his wingmen home. And when the mission required it, he delivered devastating strikes against enemy forces. His reputation grew throughout the squadron, then the group, then the entire theater. But the real test was still coming. The moment that would define not just George Davis the pilot, but George Davis the man. As the war progressed through 1943 and into 1944, George Davis found himself reassigned to a new theater of operations. The brass had been watching his performance, studying his methods, taking notes on how he managed to bring everyone home while still completing every objective. They needed pilots like him in Korea, where a new kind of war was taking shape. Not the massive bomber formations of Europe, not the carrier battles of the Pacific, but something different. Something that would test every skill he'd developed and push him into territory no pilot had ever faced before. The Korean conflict introduced a game-changer to aerial warfare. For the first time in history, American pilots would face jet-powered enemy aircraft in large-scale combat operations. The age of propeller-driven fighters was ending, and men like George Davis were being asked to write the playbook for jet combat as they lived it. No manuals existed for this kind of fighting. No training programs had prepared them for the speeds, the altitudes, the energy management required when both sides could push past 600 miles per hour in level flight. George transitioned to the F-86 Sabre, America's answer to the Soviet-built MiG-15s that were beginning to appear over North Korea in disturbing numbers. The Sabre was sleek, fast, and responsive, but it required a completely different approach to combat flying. Everything happened faster now. Decisions that used to unfold over minutes now had to be made in seconds. The margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. The MiG-15 was a formidable opponent. Soviet engineers had designed it specifically to intercept American bombers, and it showed. High-altitude performance, heavy armament, and most importantly, it was being flown by pilots who knew what they were doing. These weren't inexperienced rookies learning on the job. Many of the MiG pilots were Soviet veterans with hundreds of combat hours, flying under North Korean markings but bringing all their expertise to bear against American forces. George's first encounter with the MiG came during a routine patrol along the Yalu River. Intelligence had reported increased enemy activity in the area, but nothing concrete. Just the usual warnings to stay alert, maintain formation discipline, and be ready for anything. The anything materialized out of the sun at 35,000 feet, 4 silver shapes diving at tremendous speed toward George's flight. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. When it was over, 2 MiGs were down and the remaining enemy fighters had withdrawn across the river into Chinese airspace where American pilots were forbidden to follow. George had scored his first jet versus jet victory, but more importantly, he'd learned something crucial about this new kind of warfare. Speed and altitude were everything now. The pilot who could manage his energy better, who could climb faster, dive faster, turn at the right moment without bleeding off precious airspeed, that pilot would survive. Everyone else would become statistics. Word spread quickly through the fighter squadrons. Davis wasn't just adapting to jet combat. He was mastering it. His understanding of energy management, his ability to read an opponent's intentions and counter them before they fully developed, these skills were keeping him alive while other experienced pilots were struggling to adjust. Squadron commanders started asking for his input on tactics, on training methods, on how to prepare pilots for this new reality. But George wasn't content to just survive and share knowledge. He was hunting. Every mission became an opportunity to engage the enemy, to test new approaches, to push the boundaries of what was possible in jet combat. His kill count began to climb steadily. 5 confirmed victories, then 8, then 12. Each engagement taught him something new about his aircraft, about enemy capabilities, about the deadly mathematics of high-speed combat. The MiG pilots began to recognize his aircraft. Intelligence reports later revealed that Soviet pilots had started warning each other about the American in the Silver Sabre, who seemed to appear wherever the fighting was thickest. They developed specific tactics designed to counter his preferred attack methods. Some refused to engage when his aircraft was spotted in the area. George Davis had become more than just another enemy pilot. He'd become a problem that required special attention. That attention would come in the form of carefully planned ambushes, superior numbers, and the kind of coordinated tactics that only experienced pilots could execute. The enemy wasn't going to let George Davis continue his rampage unopposed. They were preparing something special for him, something that would test every skill he'd developed over years of combat flying. The setup came disguised as a routine bomber escort mission. Intelligence indicated light enemy activity in the target area. Standard formation, standard approach, standard everything. But George's instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. The radio chatter was too calm, the sky was too empty. Enemy fighters should have been scrambling to intercept, but radar showed nothing significant. He was right to be suspicious. High above the bomber formation, hidden in the glare of the morning sun, 16 MiG-15s waited in perfect ambush position. Experienced pilots flying aircraft that had been specially prepared for this specific mission. Extra fuel, maximum ammunition, engines tuned for peak performance. They'd been planning this engagement for weeks, studying George's tactics, his preferred attack angles, his escape routes. The trap was sprung with military precision. The MiGs dove from above and behind, using the sun and their superior numbers to maximum advantage. Within seconds, the orderly bomber formation had dissolved into chaos. Fighters scattered in all directions, trying to avoid the initial attack while regrouping for a counterattack that might never come. George found himself alone, separated from his wingman, facing odds that would have sent most pilots running for home. 16 enemy fighters against 1. Any reasonable person would have disengaged, called for help, lived to fight another day. But George Davis wasn't most pilots, and this moment would define everything he'd worked toward since that first day he'd looked up at the Texas sky and dreamed of flying. What happened next defied every rule of aerial combat ever written. George didn't run, he didn't call for backup. He turned straight into the swarm of enemy fighters and did something that military historians still study today. He attacked, not with reckless abandon, not with some Hollywood death wish. He attacked with the cold precision of a man who had calculated the odds and found a way to beat them. The MiGs had expected him to flee, to dive away from the engagement, to buy time for reinforcements. Instead, George climbed, straight up into the heart of their formation, using his saber's superior roll rate to spiral through their attack pattern like a deadly corkscrew. The first MiG never saw him coming. George's burst caught the enemy fighter center mass, sending it tumbling toward the earth in a ball of flame and twisted metal. But there was no time to celebrate, no time to even register the kill. 15 angry MiG pilots were converging on his position, their cannons already chattering death. George rolled inverted and dove, not away from the fight, but deeper into it. He was using the enemy's own numbers against them, forcing them to worry about hitting each other while he slashed through their formation like a shark through a school of fish. His second kill came during a head-on pass that lasted exactly 2 seconds. The MiG pilot had committed to a gun run and couldn't pull out in time. George's rounds found their mark and another enemy fighter disintegrated in a cloud of debris. 14 left. The odds were still impossible, but something had shifted. The MiGs were no longer attacking with coordinated precision. They were reacting to George, trying to corner him, trying to use their numbers to overwhelm his superior maneuvering. But every time they thought they had him trapped, he was somewhere else, his silver saber dancing through the sky like it was performing a deadly ballet. The third kill came during a vertical climb that pushed both aircraft to their limits. George had lured a MiG pilot into following him straight up, trading speed for altitude until both fighters were hanging on their propellers at the edge of space. The enemy pilot stalled first, just for a heartbeat, but that heartbeat was enough. George's gun spoke again, and another MiG fell toward the frozen landscape below. George Davis didn't make it home from that mission. The 14th MiG pilot, desperate and running low on ammunition, made one final attack run that caught George's saber in a vulnerable moment. Both aircraft went down over enemy territory, locked together in a final embrace that neither pilot would survive. George Andrew Davis Jr. was 29 years old. He'd been flying combat missions for less than 6 months in Korea, but in that brief time he'd fundamentally changed how the world understood jet warfare. The Medal of Honor citation would later call it conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But those words, however carefully chosen, can't capture what really happened that day. They can't explain how one man turned impossible odds into a tactical victory. They can't describe the split-second calculations, the perfect timing, the absolute mastery of his aircraft that allowed George to take down 4 enemy fighters before making his final sacrifice. What George Davis proved in the skies over Korea wasn't just that American pilots could match their enemies in jet combat. He proved that courage, skill, and determination could overcome any odds. That a quiet kid from Dublin, Texas, who used to lie in the grass and dream about flying, could become a legend that enemy pilots would fear and Allied pilots would study for generations. His tactics are still taught today. His example still inspires. And somewhere over the endless sky he loved so much, George Davis is still flying, still showing us what it means to face the impossible and choose to fight anyway. That's the real lesson of his story. Not that heroes are born different from the rest of us, but that heroism is a choice we make when everything depends on it.